Cleopatra, assassinated in 308 BCE. During the Wars of the Successors, Argead blood was a sacred and much sought after commodity. Since Alexander only had two sons, one illegitimate and the other one unborn in the summer of 323, this meant that there was no clear successor to the empire. Alexander's half-brother Philip Arrhidaeus suffered from some kind of developmental disability, and his elevation to the throne was clearly a stopgap measure to shore up the authority of Alexander's chief officers and to appease the pro-Argead sentiments of the troops while allaying suspicions about the ambitions of the successors. When Alexander IV was born and proved to be male, this was probably a big disappointment for most of Alexander's generals, many of whom were already thinking of what his death might mean for their own prospects. Since it would be years before Alexander IV came of age, there was plenty of opportunity for someone else to gain a claim to legitimacy and take the throne. After all, Philip II had come to the throne after being regent for his young nephew and then winning the support of the army, which wanted a king who would lead them in the here and now. For any ambitious successor, an obvious fast track to acquiring this kind of legitimacy would be to marry a royal princess and sire a son. Cleopatra, Alexander's full sister, the only other child to come from the union of Philip II and Olympias, was the ultimate fast track to power. Of course, she also had her own ambitions and desires. Not surprisingly, given her immediate family, Cleopatra was a strong-willed, intelligent, and stubborn woman who desired power and influence. Born around 355 or 354 BCE, Cleopatra was very close in age to Alexander, and the two of them grew up together at the Macedonian capital of Pella. Due to her childhood at court and her age, Cleopatra had grown up knowing all of the men who would one day become Alexander's chief lieutenants and primary contenders for his empire. Despite growing up as a Macedonian princess, Cleopatra had a difficult life marred by constant setbacks, separations from her loved ones, and the deaths of people she was depending on. While some more recent Alexander movies have tried to psychoanalyze Alexander by speculating on the kind of damage that he suffered as a child from seeing his mother and father argue, the real victim of this dysfunctional household was Cleopatra. Boys tended to spend more time out of the house than girls, and girls were not really allowed to wander about as freely, so if the atmosphere at home was toxic, then Cleopatra would have suffered from it more than Alexander did. In 336, Cleopatra's father Philip II was about to embark on his invasion of the Persian Empire, and as usual, he was looking for strategic marriages to shore up his alliances. The failure of his marriage with Olympias meant that he needed to create a new bond with the small Greek kingdom to his west. So Philip arranged for Cleopatra to marry Alexander I of Epirus, her mother's younger brother. This arrangement was not necessarily a bad one by the standards of dynastic marriage, since Cleopatra was marrying an uncle who was only 5 or 8 years older than her, rather than a grizzled old man, and she would become a queen in her own right in her mother's homeland, rather than some strange and unfamiliar barbarian kingdom. While celebrating her wedding, Cleopatra witnessed her father Philip get assassinated by someone whose petition he had not adequately addressed. She and her new husband must have rushed back to Epirus to avoid the possibility of getting swept up in the kind of maelstroms that almost always accompanied Macedonian successions. Things went smoothly, however, as her brother Alexander was able to secure power. Over the next couple of years, Cleopatra was probably proud of her brother when she heard of his victories in Thrace and Greece. Her husband Alexander, however, was jealous of his nephew's success, and he wanted to win his own glory. In 334 BCE, while most of the Greek-speaking world watched Alexander invade the Persian Empire, Cleopatra had to bid farewell to her husband Alexander of Epirus as he took his army to Italy at the behest of the Greek cities there, who were hard-pressed by the local Italian tribes. Prior to her husband's departure, Cleopatra had given birth to 2 young children, a son Neoptolemus and a daughter Cadmea. Epirus was hit by a grain shortage in 334, and Cleopatra, acting as regent in her husband's absence, had to secure a grain shipment from the city of Cyrene. As a ceremonial head of religion in Epirus, and as someone who was present when official visitors were received, Cleopatra was well positioned to receive news and rumors, so she was almost certainly able to follow the campaigns of both Alexanders in some detail. In Italy, Alexander of Epirus's quest for glory ended when he was killed in battle. In Epirus, women became the heads of their household in the event of a husband's death, something that was quite unique in the Greek world, where male guardianship was generally required. Thus, Cleopatra and her children did not require a guardian, and she did not seek to remarry, but rather spent her time raising her two children. In the meantime, Alexander's cousin Iosides became the new king of Epirus, so Cleopatra's role in politics was drastically scaled back. It is not clear what Cleopatra's relationship with Iosides was like, but it does seem doubtful that either of them envisioned that their sons Neoptolemus and Pyrrhus would one day become bitter rivals and fight over the Molossian throne for years. Cleopatra seems to have remained in Epirus, and she probably resided with her mother Olympias once she left Macedon in 330. Since Olympias was part of the Council of Regency for the young Iosides, it is possible that Cleopatra was also included given her family ties and her recent experience at the helm of Epirus. In 323, Cleopatra learned that her brother Alexander had died at Babylon. Cleopatra knew that the future of the Argead dynasty was in peril, since Alexander's only legitimate heir was an infant, and her half-brother Philip Aridaeus was no more than a symbol and a puppet for ambitious aristocratic generals. Receiving wind of the initial settlement at Babylon, Cleopatra and Olympias began to formulate a strategy for working their way into the middle of the empire's affairs. Their path would be considerably more difficult than it had been in Epirus, since Macedon was far less accepting of female political power than Epirus. It is very commonly assumed that Olympias, the arch-plotter, was behind Cleopatra's moves during the Successor era, but I think that between Cleopatra's experiences growing up at Pella with the men she was trying to win over, and her experiences serving as the regent of Epirus, that Cleopatra was acting as an equal partner or even on her own accord from the very outset. Both mother and daughter were fully aware of the value of Argead lineage and that their close relationship to Alexander was their chief currency. Since Olympias was past her childbearing years and she was an Epirote without any Macedonian blood, Cleopatra was the real key to the kingdom. Cleopatra was only about 31 years old in 323, and she had already proven her fertility. So she could potentially marry one of Alexander's chief successors, have a son by him, and then use her power and influence to remove obstacles to her theoretical son's rise to power. Olympias, as we have discussed in a previous video, had already provided Cleopatra with a blueprint for removing potential rivals to the throne. It seems to me that Cleopatra would stick with some variant of her marriage strategy for the rest of her life. I will trace the development of this strategy and show how Cleopatra's shift toward caution ultimately proved to be her undoing. The Lamian War broke out in 323 and led to Olympias's old rival Antipater finding himself besieged in the Thessalian city of Lamia. When he put out a call for aid, the first person who was in a position to bring a Macedonian army to the rescue was Leonidas, one of Alexander's bodyguards, a distant Argead relative, and one of the greatest heroes of Alexander's campaigns. Leonidas was one of the men most deeply attached to the memory of Alexander. His dedication even went so far as to imitate Alexander's mannerisms and to make an effort to look like him. Cleopatra wrote to him to propose marriage, and he readily agreed, as his ambitions were already excited, and he probably felt slighted by how he had been treated by Perdiccas. Leonidas crossed into Europe and paraded through the streets of Pella, where he may very well have met Cleopatra. Leonidas fought the Athenian-led coalition, but he suffered defeat, and he was slain in action. Had he lived, he was probably planning to use the prestige that he acquired from saving Antipater to take over in Europe, something that Olympias would have asked of him almost immediately, given her feelings about Antipater. Macedon was still the theoretical capital of the empire, and its chief source for military manpower after the successors began to cut back Alexander's recruitment of non-Greek men trained in the Macedonian fashion. However, there were very few big-name successors in Europe at this time, as most of them were stationed in Asia in the various satrapies. This geographical reality limited Cleopatra's choices. When Perdiccas moved into Asia Minor to reduce the region of Cappadocia, this put the most powerful successor of them all, and the guardian of the two kings, within relatively easy reach of Cleopatra, either leaving secretly or else lying to Antipater about the reason for her journey by saying something along the lines of wanting to see her young nephew. Cleopatra journeyed to the city of Sardis in the province of Lydia. When she proposed marriage to Perdiccas, he was stuck in the horns of a dilemma that he had not imagined. He had already agreed to marry one of Antipater's daughters, and to break off that engagement could potentially upset the existing, fragile balance of peace among the successors. However, if he were to marry Cleopatra, then his prestige and potential for seizing the whole empire would increase dramatically, although this would very likely alienate Antipater and anyone else who wanted to keep him off the throne. As Perdiccas pondered this issue, he decided to go ahead with his marriage to Antipater's daughter, while inviting Cleopatra to Sardis in case he felt strong enough to opt for that route. Cleopatra was probably frustrated by Perdiccas' hesitation, but she went to Sardis as this was her best option, and she probably saw preventing a solid alliance between Perdiccas and Antipater as vital, given her mother's poor relationship with the elderly general of Europe. To appease Cleopatra in the meantime and advertise his friendship with her, Perdiccas appointed Cleopatra to govern at Sardis in place of the general Menander, who was made her deputy. This move proved to be a poor idea, as Menander then fled to Antigonus and Antipater to complain about Perdiccas' ambition. Perdiccas eventually decided to marry Cleopatra, but he waited until an inopportune time to tell her about his acceptance. While Perdiccas was pondering his marriage options, Cleopatra's half-sister Cunane and her daughter Adia were intercepted while traveling to Sardis in order to arrange a marriage between Adia and Philip III. Perdiccas' brother Alcetus killed Cunane in a small battle, and the soldiers were outraged, so Perdiccas had to allow Adia to marry Philip, and this created an Argead power couple theoretically capable of producing another male offspring. At the same time, news of Perdiccas' marital double dealings and his murder of Cunane got back to Antipater, who along with his son-in-law Craterus now saw Perdiccas as vulnerable. Ptolemy had also struck north into Palestine, and he had stolen the body of Alexander the Great to use as his own emblem of legitimacy. For Perdiccas, the marriage to Cleopatra was now a way to shore up his position. From Cleopatra's perspective, however, Perdiccas' prospects had dimmed considerably in a short period of time, and she decided to wait and see what the outcome of the war was going to be before she would go ahead with the marriage. As it turned out, Cleopatra's caution was rewarded, since Perdiccas died in a mutiny on the banks of the Nile. On the other hand, had Cleopatra lent him additional legitimacy and shown that the entirety of the Argead family was on his side, Perdiccas may have fared better. At this point, we see the second phase of Cleopatra's marriage strategy unfold. This phase was marked by self-doubt and saw her do nothing productive. Cleopatra seems to have been waiting for the right offer from someone she could trust, who had the right lineage, and a solid chance of winning the entire empire. In other words, she was looking for a magic man who did not actually exist. Cleopatra stayed in Sardis, and she received Eumenes of Cardia as a guest in 320 BCE. A follower of Perdiccas who was on the run after having been officially outlawed at Triparadisus, Eumenes had been defying his would-be captors for months in western Asia Minor. Eumenes had been a close friend of Alexander, and he was also friends with Olympias and Cleopatra, so it was probably nice for both of them to see an old childhood companion. Eumenes, however, came seeking Cleopatra's aid and her seal of approval. Parading his cavalry in full view of Sardis to show her his strength, he proposed that they combine forces and meld his military skills with her legitimacy. His proposal was that he would fight the approaching forces of Antipater on the plain near Sardis, where his excellent cavalry would be best utilized, and where Cleopatra's presence on his side would spur his soldiers to make great exertions. However, Cleopatra declined his offer and asked him to leave the area lest she be implicated in the likely event that he was defeated. Some scholars think that Eumenes was proposing some kind of a marriage alliance, but he was far too well aware of the social protocols of royal marriage. Further, since Eumenes is considered an Argead loyalist, it might be too easy to assume that Cleopatra passed up a good opportunity to find a loyal ally. While Eumenes did go on to have some further successes and to frustrate Antigonus the One-Eyed until 316, this was not something that would be easy to foresee in 320. Eumenes was vastly outnumbered, and he was about to face off against Antipater and Antigonus, both of whom were vast upgrades over most of the men that Eumenes had faced in the past. Cleopatra made a rational decision, even if it was not courageous. Soon thereafter, Eumenes left to make his winter camp in Phrygia, and Antipater arrived in Sardis. Antipater had heard of Cleopatra's meeting with Eumenes, and he rebuked her harshly for treating with the enemy and acting against the interest of the Argead house, which he had served for 6 decades. Cleopatra, the daughter and sister of men who had employed and empowered Antipater, struck back harshly. We don't know her exact words since the speech has been lost, but the Byzantine writer Photius had access to the text, and he characterized her speech as beyond what one would expect of a woman. Rom thinks that by this time, the rumor that Antipater's sons had poisoned Alexander in Babylon had gained widespread attention, and that Cleopatra brought this up. Despite the fact that both parties were angry initially, they do not seem to have shared the antipathy that Antipater and Olympias had for one another, and they were soon reconciled. We don't know what their agreement was, nor do we know what Cleopatra's rationale was. Rom is probably correct that for Antipater, his first concern was probably to avoid bringing about the death of an Argead princess, since he had seen how that had worked out for Perdiccas. Cleopatra would remain in Sardis for the rest of her life, partly due to her own lack of initiative, but mostly due to her failure to escape before 2 successors whose interest ran contrary to her own arrived and claimed power in Sardis. After Antipater went back to Europe and died in 319, Sardis fell under the jurisdiction of Antigonus the One-Eyed, the new general of Asia. We don't know what the arrangement between Antigonus and Cleopatra was like, but most likely it was some form of house arrest to keep her contained and prevent her from marrying one of his rivals. Antipater may have been able to give her assurances about his intentions toward her relatives, especially her children and Epirus, but it is unclear what, if anything, Antigonus had to offer. Antigonus was known for being a little more merciful than most of the successors, and we know that he imprisoned a number of defeated foes rather than having them executed. If someone proved to be too great a threat, however, Antigonus was willing to take them out in dramatic fashion, as he showed in 316, when he reluctantly executed Eumenes, and also had the troublemaker Antigenes burned alive in a pit. It does not appear that Cleopatra ever considered the possibility of marrying one of Antipater's sons or Antigonus's male relatives, and it's not clear why, as these options would have been her best bet to get out of Sardis. Antipater had at least a few sons living in 320, and these included Cassander, who was starting to attain high rank, and as the oldest surviving son, he was in line to take over the mighty and well-connected Antipatrid family. A reconciliation and formal alliance with the Antipatrids would also make Cleopatra the beneficiary of all of the marriage alliance work that Antipater had done over the last few years. After Antigonus's arrival, Cleopatra may have been able to arrange a marriage to the old one-eyed general, despite their considerable age gap. Demetrius would have also been too young to meet her immediate needs, but if she stayed fertile for a few more years, he might do in a pinch. Had she left Sardis earlier, she might have either made it back to Macedon and restored the possibility of reconciling with the Antipatrids, or ventured to Egypt and made a play for Ptolemy, the other great power at this time. Instead, Cleopatra was isolated at Sardis from 320 until 308, in an arrangement probably resembling house arrest. She never fully fulfilled her potential of serving as the key to reuniting the Macedonian Empire. We can only imagine Cleopatra's pain at her failure, as she was the daughter of Philip II, who had built Macedon, and the sister of Alexander, who had conquered the world. Her task had been to make a strategic marriage to keep this realm together by giving the Macedonians a new heir that everyone could agree on, and she had failed. Equally painful, she never again saw her Macedonian or Epirot homelands. Her son, Neoptolemus II of Epirus, overthrew Alcides in 317, and she was not there to celebrate his accession. In 316, Cleopatra sat helpless in Asia while her mother was killed. Neoptolemus was overthrown and sent into exile in 313, and Cleopatra was not there to guide or advise him. Her nephews, Alexander IV and Heracles, were murdered in 309, and once again, Cleopatra could do nothing. It seems safe to guess that Cleopatra post-320 was not a glass bowl kind of person. It wasn't until about 308 that a new hope finally emerged for Cleopatra. After years of playing it safe, Ptolemy had started to make more aggressive forays into the Mediterranean, and he had even landed an army in Greece in 309. He had enjoyed several years where he had been consistently successful, and his fleet now dominated the Aegean. When he reached out to Cleopatra proposing marriage, she jumped at the chance. Although she was too old to bear him a child, she could rule by his side at a time when his fortunes were in the ascendant. However, some setbacks at the hands of Antigonus caused Ptolemy to become more defensive, and he did not send in a rescue force to get Cleopatra. Alarmed at the prospect of having Ptolemy marry Cleopatra and gain even more prestige, Antigonus had her assassinated in 308. While Adia was the last person to display the fighting spirit of the Argead dynasty, Cleopatra was the last of the Argeads and the last living relative of Alexander the Great with a real claim on the Macedonian Empire. Surprisingly, Cleopatra's Argead claim does not seem to have been passed down to her son, Neoptolemus II, who was never considered a candidate for the throne of Macedon, and who was murdered by his cousin Pyrrhus of Epirus, who did emphasize his kinship with Alexander the Great, and also competed for the throne of Macedon. Cleopatra was about 47 years old at the time of her death.